Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to get started in a few minutes. We're just going to give a few minutes for people to join.
Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, or evening, wherever you are.
Okay, I think we'll get started. I see attendee number is slowly going up, but it's sort of slowed, so I think people are jumping on. So welcome to the Economics of the Coffee Supply Chain webinar. Thank you so much for coming. This is a webinar where we will discuss this tool, this image you see, and it's a US-focused illustrative outlook of economics of supply chain, and it was released a few weeks ago. So we're going to go over this in some detail with our panelists. You can download this document on scanews.coffee. There's an article there and you can download it for free. And then you can also go download it on sca.coffee, the store. You can go into the store and download that for free. So just a note on where you can find it. So let's go ahead and introduce our participants. And actually, I'll start out and introduce myself, and then each of us will introduce, or the rest of the panelists will introduce themselves. I am Heather Ward. I am the Content Strategy Director at SCA, and I also work on some market research pieces with the Coffee Science Foundation. And I was one of the few staff to put this document, this tool together this year, and also the last publication that we had. Peter?
Hi, my name is Peter Giuliano. I'm the Chief Research Officer for the Specialty Coffee Association. And also, before I came to work for the Specialty Coffee Association, I ran a wholesale coffee roasting company. And before that, I managed a coffee retail company. So this is a subject near and dear to my heart.
Thank you. Heather Perry, we have two Heathers here.
Yes, we do. It's a great name, I must say. So good day, everyone. My name's Heather, and I am the current president of the Specialty Coffee Association. But my relevancy here in particular today is I'm with Klatch Coffee, and we have 8 retail locations throughout California. So we're a coffee roaster here in Southern California, and we export all over the world roasted coffee, and we have an online business, but then we also have 8 retail outlets as well.
Awesome, thank you. And we have Tim.
My name is Tim Chapdelaine. I'm the general manager of Traboca Americas, which is an importing company based out of Amsterdam. I've been in coffee for 22 years maybe. And I started in a very small importer in Minneapolis, Cafe Imports, when we were just tiny, and gradually grew and had a stint with Bowl Cafe, and now I'm with Traboca. And in the 2000s, I was on the Roasters Guild Executive Council kind of early on with the Roasters Guild, and have been involved in a lot of education and coffee ethics, coffee cupping, and education for the SCA. And I'm kind of in the nexus of a lot of in-depth discussions about what an importer does and what value they add and the costs that they charge for that in the industry. And I worked with Peter when he was in his previous employ as well. And, you know, that's about it.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so to get started, just an overview of this next hour and a half and the flow. We're going to start out with a background and history of the tool and the document and how it started, questions that were asked to begin with, how it evolved to what it is today. And then we'll go through the latest economics of the supply chain. So I just mentioned and I showed the image in the first slide that was released a couple of weeks ago. We're going to talk through that, dissect it. The panelists will go through different pieces of it and just to give some insight. And then we will go into more of a discussion, a panelist discussion around the question, how do you use this tool? Whatever position you are in the coffee supply chain, how is this useful for you? And then we will go into a Q&A session. So if you have questions as the presentation is going, please hold them till the end, till we get to that session. We will work hard to get to everyone's questions, but it will be better if you hold till that session starts. Okay, so a background. This started as really a benefit to coffee producers, asking the question, where does the money go? Lots of producers are asking that. After coffee is purchased at green, going all through the supply chain, what happens? Where does the money go? What are the costs? So in 2009, there was a Let's Talk Coffee presentation in Nicaragua, which sought out to answer this question or start to answer this question. Information was gathered on the breakdown of costs from the importer costs to roaster, retailer, things like shipping costs, packaging, labor, all the way down to cups and lids at retail. And so this was a presentation, not a formal report or a formal infographic that was put out. And really it was to build the structure of how we were going to move forward with maybe publishing some of these things and just generally how it looks. So then moving to 2014, with the same idea, we decided to SCAA at the time sent out a roaster retailer survey to about a very small study, but we looked at about 10 small to medium roasting companies and retail and gathered some information and took the aggregate. So this is the illustrative outlook from that. You might recognize this infographic from different presentations or on social media, but in 2014, we released this one. And then so moving to this updated illustrative outlook, we took different sources of information to put this document together, this tool. So we looked at the 2009 and 2014 economics of the supply chain data that we already had, some transparent trade coffee from that transaction guide from Emory University. We also had roasters and retailers feedback, and then these two on the 2017 roaster and retailer benchmarking report, as well as the 2018 infographic that Square put out a price report. So
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. Just real quick, I really want to emphasize, and maybe Peter, this is where you were headed, on the illustrative outlook terminology and kind of clarify what this means and what we're trying to do here. These numbers and moving to this is what the document looks like. This is not meant to be prescriptive. It's illustrative. It's meant to reveal more of a broad representation of these costs, not one specific set of data or one case study. These are just pieces of information put together as an aggregate. So it's not the end all be all numbers, and we're not recommending that these numbers are what it should be. It's just to paint a picture, and that's how we describe it as illustrative outlook. Peter, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was also going to mention about the benchmarking study. I think some of you probably don't know about that study, but that was actually a pretty large study where we talked to lots of roasting companies and retailing companies and aggregated that data. It's a very detailed, I think the document is over 50 pages long or about 50 pages long of much detail whereas this is what we're talking about today is a very brief and precise overview. That is a very detailed overview. So you'll hear us, maybe Heather Ward and I, making specific reference to that, and that may be something that if you're interested, you might want to go into greater detail in.
Great, thank you. Okay, so here's the document. We're going to kind of dive into it now and start with some importer costs, and we're going to ask Tim to sort of talk us through this and any insights or any extra information to provide here.
Okay, so kind of a brief overview is that, an importer is going to provide services to you, and sometimes those will bridge over into negotiating at origin prices or financing and other components. So they may play a bigger part in arriving at that green coffee price per pound or less on a scale from importer finding coffee to direct trade where you're finding the coffee yourself. And the risks that they take on for quality, price, financial issues, et cetera, will also decrease as you move to the right hand of that scale towards a direct purchase where you're negotiating the price, et cetera. But the work that is done in the middle to make sure that that coffee moves and gets to you is pretty much the same in each case, depending on the volume of the coffee, et cetera. So when you get into it, so you start with a $3.24 FOB price. And let's assume that you're shipping 320 60 kilogram or 132.28 pound bags. You come up with a shipment value. And in the case of a $3.24 coffee with 320, 132.28 pound bags, the value of that shipment is $137,144. From that, the first thing that we're going to pay, in addition to ocean freight, is going to be insurance. And insurance will typically be around 0.5% of the value of that shipment. So in this case, it's $686 that we'll pay at the time we ship the coffee and when we receive those documents. So we buy coffee FOB, and that means free on board. At the time that container crosses the rail of the ship and lands on the ship, the ownership and the liability for that coffee transfers from the exporter to us and the shipping line, in essence, right? So we buy insurance that's called maritime insurance, which covers anything that could happen while that coffee's on a boat in possession of that shipping line. And where the ownership and the liability for a coffee change is very, very important. So that means if that coffee comes all the way in and goes in the warehouse and then it transfers to you, now it's your liability. And if you haven't, once that coffee goes into your name or goes on a truck that you've designated, or it goes into a warehouse in your name, now you own it, and the insurance of that product is your responsibility. And one important piece of that is continental terminals got flooded in Sandy, and there was millions of dollars in the coffee that had been released into the name of roasters, but they had not insured, and that was a total loss for a number of roasters. Just to kind of illustrate that in coffee, where transfer is very important. So coffee goes on the boat in a container, packed up, wrapped up, Grain Pro bags, etc. We insure it, and that coffee starts to move. At some point, relatively quickly after that, those documents transfer to our bank, and then we pay the insurance and then also the ocean freight. So from South America, I used a factor of about $1,660 from, say, Peru to Oakland to get that coffee there. That number can change, and it's dependent on how many containers the importer brings in, whether or not they're part of a bigger company. So if you're part of so for example, Traboka is part of a bigger company called Trodden Organic, and we move high quality organic products all over the world. So our rates are fairly competitive with even a big importer like Ecom or Atlantic, whoever. But those things can vary, but not that much. Ocean freight is a combination of the cost of moving the container and then something called a bunker charge, which is like a fuel surcharge on an internal US shipment. So if fuel prices go up, that part will be variable or down. So the bunker charge, so we just get a quote, and that quote will include the base rate for the ocean freight plus the bunker fuel service charge that we'll get. In our calculations, we also have about a 0.7% of the value of the container that is called miscellaneous charges. And that would include things like sampling. So we all charges that are not, that we pay to someone else, we include in the costs of importing. That's just the way we work, and I think it's fairly general. So that could be sampling, that could be weighing, that could be the risk of a customs hold. So for example, when you import a container, once it gets to the port, the FDA may say, we want to inspect that. And that inspection is going to be charged to the consignee, which in this case is Traboka. And it could be $900 to $1,600. And instead of sending a bill to the roaster for that, we calculate that as a regular cost. Most people will have that. It's not really on this list, but it's one of the components of how we generate costs. And then customs. So in our case, it's going to cost us $495 to clear this into customs. So we hire FedEx Trade Network. We have a contract with them for customs clearance. And at the time that those documents hit our bank, we pay the customs clearance, we're going to pay the insurance, and we're going to pay the ocean freight. And that's while the coffee's on a boat on the way to Oakland. And then once that coffee comes off the boat, it's going to transfer to a drayage company. And so the container gets picked off the ship, it goes into the yard, and then we get a notification that that coffee is at the terminal, and we send a truck with one of those long, skinny things with the two posts on the end that they set the container on that's going to take that coffee from the port to the warehouse or directly to you if you're a roaster. So drayage is the movement of the container from the terminal at which it's released to the warehouse destination it's going to. And that could be the annex, it could be Continental, it could be your warehouse if we're doing a direct shipment to you. So for example, if you were in Kansas City, we would book the freight all the way to Kansas City, and then we would pay the drayage to take it from the rail yard to your warehouse, and then you would unload it into your warehouse. And then inbound handling is the cost of taking the coffee out of the container into the warehouse and weighing. That typically costs around maybe half a cent per pound. In this case, we put it at $416, so it's 0.3%. And that rate doesn't really include weighing. So the warehouse, the annex, Continental, whatever warehouse is receiving the coffee, they charge us a fee in what they call hundredweight, and it really ends up to be cents per pound, to load that coffee into the warehouse, put it into their system, and then give us a report on what it was, how the bags were, etc. At this point, they do an inspection on it as well. So if those bags come in stained, or anything's ripped or broken, or if there's any major issues with the container, they would inspect it on arrival, and that's included in those services. So the total landed costs for this container from South America to the annex, and obviously all these prices vary, and I'm just making estimations here, is around $4,762. So as you can see, the ocean freight, $1,660, is only 1/3 of the total costs that are incurred to put this in the warehouse. So we've got those per pound costs at around 11.25 cents. And I think the one thing that wasn't in there was the $1,000 for miscellaneous charges that we add on, which most importers would. So then the other component that's going to be in there is that the storage is going to cost you about 1/2 cent per pound per month. Now, this coffee left, let's say this coffee leaves Peru on December 15th. We get documents on December 20th and we pay for it. The clock is ticking on financing from that moment forward. And we do a lot of importing out of Ethiopia, hundreds of containers a year. And in that case, we actually pay oftentimes 3 months before the coffee leaves, or 2 to 3 months, because it takes 8 to 12 weeks for that coffee to get from milling all the way to Djibouti. So these financing costs can vary. In a place like Peru, where you pay FOB and you pay when the coffee's on a boat and on the way here, you have a lot less time to deal with. So assuming that we have around 60 days of financing from the time the coffee leaves Peru to the time that you pay for it, let's say net 30, and we use just a nominal figure of 9%, that's going to be about 4.8%, but it just depends on the, I think the interest rate that was used for this one is much lower, probably like 5%. So that financing and storage is going to be the cost of putting in the warehouse for 1 month, and then also the cost of financing it from the time we paid for it to the time you paid for it, or to the time it's released. So these are all things that you should be having conversations using the spreadsheet that Heather's going to provide to kind of build out your own system for having those conversations and costs. And you should have those conversations with your importer, meaning it's our job to educate you on what those costs are. If you're buying 2 bags spot, it's a little bit more difficult to have that conversation because the costs of owning spot coffee are very high for us. The risks are very elevated. So then the importer margin here, this 15 cents, I imagine that this is a case where you're pretty involved in the negotiations, or you're buying a volume of coffee, or it's like a direct trade container where the quality risk, at least you're having a portion of it, right? So, you know, this 15 cents is kind of a basic figure, and you may not, you know, from one importer to another, this number can vary a lot depending on what they do. So that means that the total amount that an importer would add to your cost FOB is going to be about 31 cents. And if you look at this cost model, you're assuming pretty efficient shipping, probably not a customs inspection, and you're assuming that you have your own account with the warehouse and that they release this coffee as a full container to you in the warehouse, and it goes into your name, and you're responsible for paying to load that onto a truck in whatever quantity you do, and then bringing it in, and you're paying for this coffee somewhere between net 10 and net 30 as a whole. So a couple of sidebars here about, you know, how you can involve yourself more in this process. The successful roasters in the United States, if they consolidate their purchasing to things that they either know very well, and that could include a direct trade relationship, that could include buying from origin and using an importer to bring it in, who also has a good relationship with that exporter. If you consolidate your purchasing and then consolidate your shipping inland, so for example, you reduce 10 to 1 full to 5 full pallets at a time for a small roaster, a half to a full truckload for a large roaster, then you can start to have a conversation about what all these numbers are. This 15 cents, if you start to take coffee over 6 months in like 20 releases, that number is going to change because there's an internal cost for releasing an invoice for an importer. And the best way that you can keep these costs down, because every penny you pay green ends up multiple pennies on the other end of a roaster, is to focus your purchasing with core suppliers who do a good job. And you can take an importer relationship where you're buying a product that they're very strong in and increase your purchasing, and eventually involve yourself much more in these discussions and potentially even at origin. Everything has its time, and that's a very efficient way to purchase coffee. And if the simple rule with buying coffee, whether you're an importer selling it to someone else or roasters roasting it and selling it to customers, is do more of what works. And if you focus on the healthy relationships where you feel you're getting great service and there's a value to what these people do for you, then the costs that they charge you are potentially discussed. And coffee operates best when you have good open relationships and where you avoid, where you build collaborative relationships versus adversarial ones. And, as an importer, we're always in the position of being the intermediary or the middleman. And the people that we hire to make sure this coffee moves and gets in are really skilled, quite intelligent people who are good at finance and logistics, et cetera. So you're going to look at all these costs in the context of what service you're getting for them, and you can break them out. So and before we move on, if you have any particular questions about these costs, maybe while it's fresh in your mind, you could go ahead and send them in the message body, and Heather can forward them to me. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. So let's move on to the next section of this document. And I'm going to ask Peter to put his roaster hat on and talk through these roaster costs, these next 2 slides.
Yeah, so thanks, Heather. As Tim mentioned, so I'm speaking in the place of the roaster here. So after it goes from FOB, right, that's the boat, as Tim explained, it goes through the importing process, which Tim just explained in detail. The next sort of phase, the next phase of the coffee's supply chain is the roaster. And as Tim just mentioned, oftentimes the roaster is very involved with the importer in terms of taking responsibility at certain points, negotiating certain elements, sometimes determining what the FOB green price is going to be, sometimes not, depending. But oftentimes the roaster has at least some visibility on the importing side. But now we're shifting into the elements that the roaster has direct control of. So I'll walk these through and discuss them a little bit, and then we'll move on to the next phase, which is the retailer phase. So the first element here is shipping costs. Okay, and here we're talking about shipping from the warehouse, often at the port, to the door of the roasting facility or the warehouse that the roaster has near their place. And then the costs associated with releasing that coffee to the roaster and getting it out of the transportation into the warehouse. And in this case, we're looking at about 8 cents of costs there. Should be noted that in-country transportation costs, using trucks usually, can be even more expensive than the oceanic lines, the container ships that are bringing coffee from the port, which are very efficient, and that's a much more streamlined process often than the trucking lines that roasters use to bring coffee to their own warehouses. Then the coffee gets roasted, and one of those elements that's often a surprise to people when I talk to them, whether they're coffee producers, are often surprised by this factoid. I talk to a lot of coffee journalists who are writing about, journalists in the public, press that are writing about coffee. Most of them, it is a surprise to know that the coffee, the first thing that happens when you roast it is it shrinks by a lot. And that's because the moisture goes out of the green coffee, and you lose all of that moisture right away. Roughly 12% of green coffee is water, and all of that gets vaporized during the roasting process. And then a little more stuff too literally goes up in smoke and out of the roaster. So a typical shrink for a roasted coffee is 18%. It'll be more for a very darkly roasted coffee. It'll be a lot less for a very lightly roasted coffee. But 18% is a reasonable amount. So that presents a cost. When you put some of your raw material out of the chimney of the roaster, that is a cost. And in this case, it's an estimate of about 80 cents against that green coffee price that we have. So just from a strict cost perspective, we've now gone to $4.42 in this hypothetical pound of coffee. Then you start to add some of the costs of doing business for the roaster. Packaging is coffee bags and usually cardboard boxes that are, after you bag the coffee, you often put it in a cardboard box for shipping. and we're estimating that here at around 41 cents. Of course, that can vary a lot depending on quality of packaging and size of packaging. In other words, if you're packaging it in 8-ounce bags, it's going to be a lot more expensive than if you're packaging it in 5-pound bags. But anyway, here the estimate for the packaging cost is 41 cents. And then here, the direct labor cost, that is the cost really of the roaster themselves, the roasting personnel, the person who is turning the coffee from green coffee to roasted coffee. So that direct labor is estimated here at about 53 cents. That varies a lot according to the scale of the roaster. If it's a roaster operating a 90-kilogram roaster all day long, they're going to be much more efficient than a person who's in a shop environment roasting on a 10 kilo or a smaller roaster, and doing lots of batches. So that's how that varies. We've got this number here, certification cost. Oftentimes coffees carry with them costs associated with either certification like organic or fair trade certification that sort of apply to the green coffee. There are other certifications like B Corp, for example, that certify something about the roaster. The roaster, if in an organic coffee scenario, the roaster also has to be certified organic. So that incurs some cost here. So we wanted to recognize those costs as costs, and that's about 4%. So now we've brought 4 cents rather. So now we've brought our material costs up to $5.40. So here comes a big number, and I think this might be the biggest single number besides the green coffee cost in the whole document, and that's this $2.93 that comes from sales, general, administrative, or SG&A for the roaster. And it's important to pay attention to this number, not only because it's a big one, but because it includes a lot, and because this is where a tremendous amount of the variation in the coffee roasting company is. So this is where the cost of doing business as a coffee company, besides the mechanical part of turning the green coffee brown and putting it in bags, lie. So if it's a roasting company, for example, that does travel to origin to interact directly with coffee farmers, this is where that cost would lie, and that's a cost. If it's a coffee company that does a lot of training for their wholesale coffee company customers, that's where this cost would lie. Any advertisement that they do, any of the payment of staff outside the roasting personnel themselves. So we're talking about accounting staff, administrative staff, but also executive staff, the coffee buyers, the educators, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all go into this number. And so you might be thinking, wow, I could use a lot more detail about what this number is. And I think that's a very logical and a very sort of important instinct. The truth is this varies a lot from company to company. But one of the reasons I mentioned the benchmarking guide earlier is it does go into a lot of the micro detail about what's included in these kinds of costs, typically for different sizes and capacities of roasters. This also will vary a lot depending on the geography of a roaster. This particular number is mostly a labor number. In fact, it's basically entirely a labor number. And of course, labor costs will vary depending on the geography. In New York or Los Angeles, the labor number is going to be very different than it is in another part of the country. So there's a lot to be discussed here, and also a lot of interest in exactly what is included in this number. But all of that number is in control of the roasting, the management of the roasting company. That's under the auspices of the decisions of whoever's leading the roasting company. This next number, this 40 cents, are things that are out of the control generally of the management. That's interest, depreciation, amortization, and leasehold, the kind of overhead associated with lease. So that's less. Some of the other overhead is included in that previous number. So there, now we've gone up to a cost basis of $8.73. So with that number, then we go to our next slide, and we can see that if the roaster is selling the coffee at a wholesale level at $9.40, which is our hypothetical here, which would not be unusual, and their costs are $8.73, which we got from the previous page, then you've got a pre-tax profit of 67 cents. Then you apply state and federal taxes of around 23 cents, which we calculated by available tax rates. Then you have a net profit to the coffee roaster of about 44 cents a pound. And that number is maybe a surprise to some people. But this is one of those places where, as Heather mentioned, there's a lot of interest, I would say, from the producer community about where all these numbers come from and what they are. And also, I would say, from the consumer community, the coffee consumer, the person that's buying a cup of coffee at a coffee shop, or in the barista or retailer community, about what this looks like. So I think this is a fair picture of what a sort of a normal, reasonable coffee roasting company, how they might operate in a specialty context, and what their net profit might be. All right, now I hand the coffee to the retailer, which is Heather Perry.
And you can see all the costs that we have on our side. Okay, so starting a little bit with just what are we going to sell the cup of coffee for? So in this scenario, we're going to say a 16-ounce cup of coffee for $2.80. And again, that's completely different depending on where you are across the country and what size you're selling. But for right now, those are the numbers that we're going to use. So based on kind of brewing to gold cup standards, specialty standards, the number of cups of coffee in 1 pound you're going to get are about 15 cups. Now, the yield per pound of coffee, the way this is worded is interesting to me, but we're talking about dollars there. What's your dollar yield? And so it's $42 you're going to make off of selling that pound of coffee as 16-ounce cups, okay? You're going to use Peter's scenario of your coffee cost of $9.40 for your pound of coffee there. Your cups, for those 15 cups that you sold, are going to be $1.80. Your lids are going to be 80 cents. Your stir sticks are going to be 30 cents. And your condiment cost is going to be 70 cents. Now, that's not per cup. That's talking about to sell those cups in that pound of coffee. So those 15 cups. Some of the things that I think retailers forget to add in, or people kind of overlook, is, yeah, my cup of coffee, we used to hear this all the time, a cup of coffee costs 15 cents. I should get into the coffee business and become a millionaire. And as you can see, the coffee is one small cost of what the retailer is actually using. You go into a coffee house, whether you get ceramic or paper, typically the cost of this is the same. We're starting to see a little bit of a trend towards that changing, which it's very interesting, and we'll see how that works. And I think there's a lot of reasons to do that for sure, but we'll see how that works out. But whether you get it in a mug for here, and I have no additional cost outside of that initial purchase of ceramic where that goes further, or whether you get it to go and I have to add in a paper cup, sleeve potentially, lid, if we're doing a stopper, you have those in there also. And the majority of the coffee that we sell, if we're talking about batch brew black coffee, the majority of the customers are adding some sort of condiment to it, some sort of cream, some sort of sugar. Half and half is obviously more expensive than milk if you're putting that out, and alternative milks tend to run around that cost, if not higher as well. So I find that a lot of retailers get lost in that area, that calculation of adding in your lid and your condiments and your stir stick type area. But you can see off of a pound of coffee, we're grossing about $29. One thing that I want to point out here as well is this is for batch brew in particular. These numbers can also change if you're talking about doing pour over versus batch brew quite substantially. One of the things that's not in here at all is any sort of waste. And so when we talk about the movement from batch brew to pour over, a large part of it is you can see that coffee is expensive, as we're going to get to. And so if you're a retailer and you say, hey, I brewed a half gallon and I want to, it's important for me to keep it fresh, so I'm going to dump it every 30 minutes, let's say. Or let's do it off of a gallon. You know, you've got 8 cups of coffee in there in that gallon. If you've only sold 2 of those, you're dumping 6 cups of coffee. That's really substantial. That's real money down the drain, very literally, in the sense of a cup of coffee. So that's a big reason that we really started to see pour over become a bigger movement, is freshness, but also that waste aspect when you're talking about decaf drinkers. You know, decaf drinkers, it's kind of like, yeah, the pot's been there all day. It's been there since 10 a.m. It's now 4 in the afternoon and I want a cup of decaf. So that's a lot of what kind of spurred that movement, at least in a lot of the specialty movement where we are. Labor cost here, we're calculating at 21%. And again, this is for batch brew. You get into pour over, you see a substantial number change in that labor cost. Leasehold, 10%. One of the numbers that I like to tell people to kind of use if they're looking at a retail location, I always like to tell people, you know, look at your total all-in costs to be there. Look at your triple nets, your cams, look at your rent. You want to pay it in 3 days is the easiest way to do it. So, you know, if that rent that you're looking at is going to cost you $6,000, you want to be making at least $2,000 a day to keep that leasehold number where you want it. If you're looking at a space that's $15,000, you need to be doing $5,000 a day in sales. Are those attainable numbers for those types of locations? So that's kind of an easy number that I tell people to look at to kind of hit that 10% leasehold. Utilities, about 2.5%. Marketing, 3%. Marketing is one of those things that can be done in a lot of different ways, and you can calculate it a few different ways. It can be, hey, I'm going to get my cups printed. It could be, I'm going to advertise in something. It could be, I'm going to advertise on Yelp, you know, something through that type of thing. But that marketing piece is also a really important piece, and just the growth of your business. You know, one of the most important things that I think in a business is making sure that you're sustainable in the sense that you can be operating next year. And I think leaving that marketing piece is an important piece of it that sometimes people will cut out initially. There's repairs and maintenance is that next one, 2%. I think, you know, marketing and repairs and maintenance are see people where they cut as soon as the numbers get tight, it's where they start to pull back. But there's something to be said that if you want to make, you have to spend money to make money. And that's not to put yourself, you know, completely underneath or anything, but that is to say you want to make sure that in a retail environment, you have a nice looking place. You have a comfortable environment that your customers want to hang out in, whatever that means. Simple things like bathrooms is something that how a lot of people will evaluate whether or not they want to go back there. It's just, was the bathroom a nice experience to use? So keeping up on that repair and maintenance piece, I also think is really important to making sure that you're taking care of your business and taking care of your customers. And then just general administration, 15% there. So your net operating profit per pound is about $6.53. So you can see we had $29 if we just took out that kind of cost of goods piece, but we're all the way down to $6.53 on that pound. You add in your depreciation, interest, and amortization, and again, your taxes, and your net profit per pound is about $2.90, or if you look at the percentage, about 7%. And I would say if you talk to most small retailers out there, you're in that 5 to 7% range quite often for small to medium businesses. So that's a very real number. If you could be operating at a 5 to 7% profit, you're kind of right in that ballpark of where you need to be and where you should be.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Heather. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the tool, end of the document. So we just wanted to have a discussion, just questions for the panelists or for Heather and Tim and Peter even. How do you use the tool? So in your day-to-day, and maybe Heather, we'll start with you.
Sure.
It was super useful going through all of that and your thoughts on that insight, but further, how do you use this tool?
So this is something that we use on a regular basis for evaluating our costs on a regular basis. And one thing I should mention is that even for us, so we have 8 different cafes, all in California, but in different markets: an airport market, San Francisco market, inland of LA, and outside of LA. And so even all of those numbers will change depending on what market we're in. So for the same business in just a slightly different place, all of those numbers definitely change as well. And so I think that that's something to keep in mind. So for us, we have kind of company goals where we say, hey, you know, we want our leasehold to be this on average for our retail stores. But all of my retail stores may vary between 7 and 12%, depending on the lease that I was able to get for whatever reason. My cost of coffee does not change outside of in regards to that piece of it per store, but the price that I sell it at will change because of things like leasehold, because of things like labor. We don't pay the same price for labor inland as we do for Pasadena, as we do for San Francisco, and so those costs have to be put throughout that chain as well. So we are using this tool on a regular basis. One of the things that I think sometimes people are afraid to do is charge what it costs them. And you really need to know kind of like, what does it cost me to be in business? Am I able to make sure that I'm here the next time? And putting value on your product and putting out a good product. And so using tools like this helps you know, here's what my actual costs are. So we use this on a for ourselves, we use it on kind of I'm looking at this on a daily basis. Our managers look at this on a monthly basis.
So like
Heather, I had a quick question, maybe just kind of as a side note. So, you've been around a long time. You're a pretty successful company. You've had notoriety and been named Roaster of the Year, and you've had a lot of different things. You've had barista championships. Your business is kind of an early specialty company that's been fairly successful. At what point did were there changes that happened in your estimation of this? Did you have a CFO? Did you figure this out on your own for a long time? And how did that process go for you? Because I think a lot of times, smaller roasters and retailers, they have to decide when to get outside help to get a better grasp on these numbers, to actually be able to dig into them and figure out what their real numbers are versus just an estimate.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that it comes down to is I think the numbers, if you're operating one store, I always kind of think your most important numbers are know what your cost of goods are, know what your payroll is, and then you kind of know where your personal cost is. Like, are you working the store? To me, that's something that sometimes individual retailers will miss out. Is it's like, oh, I'm making this much, I didn't pay myself at all, and so you have to take that cost into it as well, is your labor. So you kind of know those, and then kind of know where your bottom line is. And if you're making money, you're good there. When these numbers and the specifics of these really become key, I think is with scale, funny enough. I think the bigger you grow, the more important that these numbers go. And I even mean from one store to two store, because you're no longer, if you're kind of an owner operator, you're at that store 40 to 60 hours a week. So you're aware of waste. You're aware of these types of things. It's interesting how you open a second store and all of a sudden your costs go up. It's like, wait, how did my costs go up? It's like, well, because you're not the one doing it anymore. So now your waste has started to increase, and now this has started to go up. The reality is I always say, and this is no discredit to my staff. My staff does an amazing job, but it's not their business, right? So I always say, it's like, if I was able to work the store, every day, all the hours, I would probably see a 5% increase in sales just because of the care that I give that they will never have. And that's not a discredit to them at all. But that's another reason when you go from one store to two, you might see a small decline there because it's no longer the owner kind of talking to the people anymore. So I think those are things to look at. As far as when to bring in outside help, it depends on how much you hate Excel. I think is one piece of it. If you hate Excel, quickly bring in outside help. If you're an Excel fan, you can actually do a lot of this relatively easily. And it's not necessarily Excel. I'm terrible at QuickBooks, and so I took a QuickBooks course to really help me figure out kind of, working with our CPA, where should I be allocating things? Where should I be looking at things? How do we best utilize QuickBooks for our business? Having multiple locations, to me, I need to be able to see the retail segment versus the online business versus the roasting business. And I also need to be able to see, okay, now how is each individual retail store doing against each other? And so figuring out that was a lot of it. And a lot of it is just taking the time, honestly, to just look at the numbers, take the time to making sure, POS systems have so many capabilities these days that very few people use. It's a pain to set up. I mean, make no mistake, it is not fun. It is not easy. But once you do it, it can be a super valuable resource. So making sure that like the tools that you have right in front of you, you know how to use them and you are using them would be a really big thing.
Yeah, if I could just emphasize that a minute, I worked in wholesale for a long time, selling coffee to wholesale companies since the mid 90s. I mean, selling coffee wholesale to retailing companies since the mid 90s. And one thing, so over like 20 years, I saw this, and the thing that I saw so consistently in the pre-POS system age and the post-POS system age is the people that understood how their business works were the ones that succeeded. It was nothing about the quality that they had or the, how good their training was, although the people that train well and do good quality do better than other ones. But the real determinant of whether you fail or succeed is whether you understand the mechanics of how your business works. And so answering the question of how to use this tool, using this as maybe a starting point to understand not only your business, if you're a retailer or a roaster or an importer, but also the partners that you work with. Meaning, if you're a roaster, you're often buying coffee from importers and selling it to retailers. And so you need to not only understand how your business works, but understand how your partner businesses work. And that's a huge advantage. And this is maybe a first step towards that. The other way that I use this tool today is to help communicate to others how the business works. So one of the interesting takeaway, if you look at it, is that both the roaster and the retailer in this hypothetical make about 7% of profit. And so that's an interesting number. That is lower than a lot of people think it is, honestly. One of the things that I use this thing for is I often, as part of my job now, I answer press inquiries about people who are writing about specialty coffee. And I had an inquiry a couple of weeks ago from a writer who was asking me to fact check a quote, and the quote was that when we sell a pound of coffee at retail, the coffee producer gets paid only pennies, and that's not what the reality of the situation is. So there are some myths out there about how much it actually costs to produce a cup of coffee or a pound of coffee at retail. And when you start to look at it like this, you see that the biggest cost, of course, is labor. Labor at the roasting company level, labor at the retailing level, et cetera. All the rest of the costs are minor compared to labor costs and administrative costs, because it costs money to run a business, And so paying baristas, paying roasting staff, paying warehouse staff, paying administrative staff, paying accounting staff, all of that stuff is the major factor in how much a cup of coffee costs and a pound of coffee costs. And that, strangely, even though that is very intuitive once you say it that way, that is not immediately obvious to people until they start to look at the breakdown. And I think that's also important to communicate. Not only I'm talking about, communicating that to consumers and to the press and to baristas and stuff, but it's also very important to communicate to the producing community. We're going to be doing another one of these same webinars in the Spanish language, because, as Heather said, the genesis of this project was to communicate this information to the people who are producing coffee in the first place. And one of the things that they oftentimes are surprised by is how much, because most producers nowadays can see that if they're selling their coffee at an FOB price of $3.50 a pound, it turns into, $18 or $20 a pound on selling online at retail, or $3 a cup at a coffee shop, and they wonder where all that money went. And the answers are in here, and the answers are mostly things like labor and overhead, and not just, So go ahead, Tim.
I would reiterate Peter's first point about the importance of this. I mean, so we do a lot of work in Ethiopia, and when Ethiopian producers look at the costs that we charge, the problem is that they start to look at Ethiopian labor costs, which are insanely different than the US, right? Just as a matter of course, right? But I do think that the important thing is that each person in this chain has a role, right? So Peter said, as a roaster retailer, you're looking at who you're buying coffee from, and you're assessing the value of those vendors, right? And all these costs that you look at, you're looking for someone to do a service for you. And when we go to work with a particular supplier in a country, we do the same thing. We have a vendor rating system that we use. How quickly do they ship coffee? How accurate are the samples? How much inputs do we have to put in to make sure that the coffee we're cupping is the coffee we're getting, right? And so all these components are both ways, and it's the same thing, especially when you go to selling to roasting clients, and it's not really that different. Do they pay? Are they strong businesses? Are they going to be successful? Because everybody invests time, resources, and risk in their relationships. So, you know, as a roaster retailer or a wholesaler, you're saying, is this a client that I want to invest, you know, buying a half container of coffee for and roasting and delivering to them? Because if that client fails, then all of a sudden now I've got a half container too much coffee. So all these components, you know, the really important part of specialty coffee and what seems to be successful is that people are always curious. They're always digging into these costs. And it's not really the sexy side of the business. The sexy side of the business is I'm a great barista, or I'm a great roaster, or I'm really good at finding coffee. But none of that works really well without someone who's willing to dig into numbers, as Heather said, and make sure that those numbers are working. And when you invest your company's resources in either a sales or a sourcing relationship on either side, your ability to assess the capabilities of those two partners is really important. And the better you are internally at doing that, the better you are at choosing which partners you're going to spend your time and energy on.
Great. Okay, so I think it's a good time to move into the Q&A. We are at the top of the hour, but we're going to put aside 15 more minutes to have questions. But before we get to that, I just wanted to note this template that we've put together, which is basically just an empty template in Excel with all the calculations populated that we're going to put on the website and have available for you to download, so you can enter in your numbers in the highlighted cells, and it'll populate based on this tool, which what we have populate for you. So that will be a good extra piece to this. So so Q&A, we had a question from Ruben from Honduras. He says, how do you get the $3.24 price for green coffee? For Oots and Rainforest Alliance, 40 cents per pound is acceptable, but I think for fair trade, it's more than that.
I can speak to that. To estimate that $3.24, obviously that can vary a lot according to origin of the coffee and quality and other aspects. We looked at the transparent trade data. We also looked at data from our benchmarking study that I mentioned earlier. And we just kind of chose a price based on aggregating those data as a reasonable price that a roaster might pay at FOB for specialty grade coffee. I think what the other part of the question is talking about a premium that Oots and Rainforest Alliance have per coffee, and that would be included in that FOB price. Those kinds of green coffee premiums, also fair trade has a premium associated with it, that would be included in that FOB price. And the certification costs that we talk about later are costs to the roaster for certification.
Great, thanks, Peter. Next question, could we help reduce the labor cost by roasting some at origin where labor is relatively cheaper?
This has been tried a number of times, and you run into a couple of different things that would potentially affect this. One, roasters are always trying to reduce the code time, the amount of time that a coffee can be used from the time it's roasted. So even many of the large roasters who are selling in retail, they're trying to keep the time from roasting to sales to 90 days. Typically, it's going to take 45 days on an average to get a coffee from the Americas into the US with customs clearance and other issues. So you're already at a number of weeks, 6.5 weeks from the time it was roasted. And that coffee is changing. So if you're talking commercial coffee or coffee that can withstand, or dark roasted coffee that might withstand that time better, yes, it's a possibility. Now, the other way to counter that is to air freight it. But when you start air freighting coffee, you add $1 a pound in just freight costs. So, you know, a number of people have done this. Ethiopia is doing it right now. People did it out of Nicaragua. There was a roaster in Costa Rica who was selling a lot of coffee via this model a number of years ago. Some have been successful, some have not. But typically specialty coffee, people like to have it roasted close to them, both, you know, physically and in time. The way that shipping works in the US, that time doesn't matter, that place doesn't matter as much anymore. But, you know, yes, it's a possibility, but.
Yeah, I agree with Tim. It has been tried in the past. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't. This is, though, a place where conditions are changing quickly right now, as global communications and global transportation are changing rapidly. So this is one of the things that I'm keeping an eye on as an observer of the specialty coffee scene. And also the other thing is specialty coffee is developing so rapidly in Latin America and Africa and in Asia, which is where coffee is traditionally grown. Now there are especially coffee scenes emerging there, especially coffee roasting companies really thriving in those places. So we might see some changes there. I think that's a place that is very, I think, interesting as an observer of especially coffee right now.
Okay, I may ask my colleague Sarah to jump in. Sarah, I don't see any more questions. I don't know if anybody has any questions or if someone wants to speak. I think you can do the hand up setting. All right, it looks like we don't have questions. I don't know, any further thoughts from any of you on maybe something we didn't touch on that you've been thinking about, or anything at all, other insights overall?
I would just say if you're looking at this and you're like, man, my numbers are nowhere near this, that's not necessarily a bad thing. These are just averages that we're putting out there. So everything is going to be different for you. You know, I think the important thing is that you are making money so you can continue to be in business. And so I think make sure that you've got some money there at the bottom so that you can continue to stay. I think that's an important piece of it. And then the other thing that I would say, if you're a single shop, I would make sure that you're calculating your labor in. I think that's something that a lot of small businesses miss. And make sure you know what your time and worth is, so you know if you need to change your business model. You might think that you're doing okay, but you're not paying yourself and you're putting in so many hours. Calculate that and say, oh wow, I'm actually not covering my salary. I need to change something, and that might give you some ideas as well. So use the tools, make sure all of your costs are in there.
I would also add on to what Heather said. I've seen a number of small roasters start out and they kind of wing it and they start roasting and doing this stuff. And in 1999 or 2004, that was a lot easier. The market is much, much more competitive now. And the industry in general is, if you're going to be successful, the importance of sound business processes has really grown, meaning there's lots of large companies out there. Companies that were small, like the one Peter worked at, are now big, and they're in the marketplace and they have economies of scale and they can compete. They know their numbers very well. Don't be afraid to ask for help. And if there's someone who's a consultant who can help you dig into those costs or do that, it could be a couple $1,000s that you spend early on to get a grasp on some of the costs or some of the components. It could be, roasters are going to spend money learning how to roast and learning how to cup and learning how to package and learning how to process. If you don't have that skill, like you didn't come from another roasting company or you haven't been exposed to it before, don't be afraid to ask for help. This is a very collaborative industry. It's sometimes tough to get your potential competitors to share information with you, but there's decent consultants out there who do a lot of good work who could help you. And to go back to the main point, the companies that know what they need, that know what their volumes are, that buy the right amounts of coffee and take them in a sound in the period of time that they agree to take those coffees, those companies are more attractive as a client to us as an importer, and we tend to self-reduce. As our risk decreases, as the likelihood of the contract being fulfilled as it's laid out increases, that customer becomes more valuable, and we're much more open to conversations, and we're much more likely to preemptively make sure that those people get a good deal as they grow. And that comes directly from how well does the buyer and the accountant and the estimators and the finance people, how well do they work together, so that when the buyer comes to us with a particular purchase strategy, we know that that's a good strategy and it's going to be fulfilled. And I think these business skills are often underrated. As importers, we're forced to think about these things all the time. And Heather, I'm sure as your company has grown, the way that you bought coffee 10 years ago, or what you bought and how much, the discussion about what you purchase, how much, and what quality and what price is much more in depth now and much more informed.
Great. We have another question that popped in. What about the role of technology to preserve the quality of coffee from roasting to consumption? Is that changing?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I was referring to in terms of the dynamics changing a lot lately. We've seen a number of coffee packaging innovations happen over the last 5 years, let's say, and also new developments in like soluble coffee. The advent of high quality soluble coffee, for example, has been something of note. So I think all of these things will factor in here. And then another thing that's not about it's also about quality and also touches on this labor thing is as technology, coffee preparation technology changes. The other thing, cold brew coffee, ready to drink things, these are all very, very, very dynamic and changing right now. So, and all of these will have an effect. Still, though, the dominant model is the one that we just in specialty coffee is the one that we just characterized here. But it's absolutely true. Technology is already changing that.
Great. Another question. I've been asked about being kosher certified. Is that a common cost?
Are you kosher certified, Heather? Counterculture was during my time, and we did incur that cost. It would have been included under that certification cost, and it was so I would say some roasters do it, others don't.
Great. Okay, so I don't see any further questions. I think we can wrap up. I just want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you to the panelists for bringing your thought and expertise to this. And again, you can download the document on sca.coffee, and then we will also have some follow-up resources like the spreadsheet I talked about, for just a tool if you wanted to figure out and play with your own numbers. And that's about it. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day, evening, wherever you are in the world.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.